We're diving into a story today
Uh-huh.
that's both perplexing and really kind of poignant.
Yeah.
A judge found dead in his courtroom
Oh, wow.
on his last day on the bench.
On his last day.
So what led to this really tragic event, and what larger questions does it raise about our justice system
Yeah.
and even our democracy?
It certainly prompts us to look deeper, doesn't it? Beyond the headlines and into the complexities of a life dedicated to public service.
Absolutely. We're talking about Judge Stephen Yekel, 74,
Okay.
a state court judge in Effingham County, Georgia.
Yeah.
Our sources for this deep dive are an NBC News article and a Reddit thread, where, as you
Yeah.
might imagine, people are grappling with this news.
It's fascinating how such an event sparks such varied reactions. Some seek understanding, others offer condolences, and then there's that dark humor
Right.
that often surfaces online as a way to process difficult emotions.
Exactly. And navigating those reactions is part of what we'll be doing today.
Sure.
So let's lay out the basic facts. On New Year's Day morning, January 1st, 2025, an Effingham County Sheriff's deputy found Judge Yekel deceased in his courtroom. The court wasn't in session,
Right.
it being a holiday, and the initial assumption is suicide pending an official autopsy.
And this is where the timeline becomes particularly striking. Yekel was a recent appointee of Governor Brian Kemp.
Okay.
Having served just 2 years, he just lost his re-election bid with his term set to end on December 31st, 2024.
Literally the day before he was found.
Yeah.
It adds a layer of, I don't know, almost a sense of inevitability
Oh,
to
yeah.
the story, even though that's probably just our human brains trying to make sense of something senseless.
Our minds do seek patterns, even in tragedy.
Right.
But there's another detail that adds to the complexity here. Yekel attempted to resign a day early, citing concerns about the exceptionally low voter turnout in the runoff election he lost. Only 6% of eligible voters participated, and he seemed to question whether that truly represented the will of the people.
Yeah.
Governor Kemp rejected that resignation request.
Oh. Which, on the surface, seems like upholding procedure.
Right.
But knowing what happened next, it makes you wonder about the weight of that decision,
Yeah.
both for Yekel and for Kemp.
Yes, it raises questions about the balance between following protocol and recognizing when individual circumstances might warrant a different approach. It's a dilemma that many leaders face, and there's rarely an easy answer.
Now let's shift gears to the online reaction.
Okay.
Specifically this Reddit thread that's been quite active. There's that gallows humor you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
One commenter wrote, "Of course it was his final day. He's dead."
Yeah.
Which, while insensitive, is a way some people cope with shock, I suppose.
It's a defense mechanism, a way to deflect the emotional impact of a tragedy by turning it into something almost absurd. But there are also comments expressing genuine concern,
Right.
some questioning whether there's more to the story than we know.
Right. And a few seem almost unsurprised that they sense a deeper unease. But the comment that really got to me was, he laid down on the bench for one last time, and that is where they found him. It's so stark, so visual, it makes you think about his final moments alone in that courtroom.
That comment, while brief, speaks volumes. It suggests a possible disillusionment, a sense of finality, not just with his career, but perhaps with the very system he was part of.
And then there's this one. That's what happens when you make your job your identity.
Oh.
It's a harsh statement, but it makes you consider the potential psychological toll of a career like judging, especially when it ends not on your own terms.
You've touched on a crucial point there. The pressures and expectations placed on individuals in high-profile positions can be immense. And when one's sense of self is so closely intertwined with their professional role, the loss of that role can be profoundly disorienting.
Especially for someone like a judge who holds such a position of authority and makes decisions that impact people's lives in such a significant way. I'm curious, from your perspective, how do judges navigate those pressures? Do they ever truly switch off? Or does that sense of responsibility follow them everywhere?
That's a question that deserves its own deep dive. And we'll certainly get into the psychological aspects of judging in more detail later, but I think it's safe to say that maintaining a healthy boundary between one's personal and professional life is crucial for anyone in a high-stress role. It's about recognizing that you are not your job,
Yeah.
that your worth as a human being extends far beyond your professional accomplishments or failures.
It's a message that resonates far beyond the courtroom, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. In today's world where work often dominates our lives and our identities, it's a message we all need to hear.
And it makes you wonder, could anything have been done differently in Judge Yekel's case? Were there signs that were missed? Could support systems have been stronger? These are heavy questions, and it's important to remember that we're dealing with a human tragedy here.
Indeed. And while it's natural to search for answers and try to make sense of what happened, it's also important to approach this with empathy and respect for all involved.
Absolutely. We're not here to sensationalize or speculate, but to explore the complexities of this event and hopefully gain some insights into the larger issues it raises. Issues like the potential isolation of those in positions of power, the weight of responsibility they carry, and the delicate balance between upholding procedure and recognizing human needs.
And let's not forget the issue Yekel himself raised, that of low voter turnout. It might seem like a tangent, but it speaks to a broader concern about the health of our democracy and the importance of civic engagement.
You're right. If only a small fraction of eligible voters are participating, does that truly reflect the will of the people? And what does it say about our collective faith in the system?
Those are questions we can't shy away from. And as we delve deeper into this story, we'll explore those questions and others with the nuance and respect they deserve.
So we've got a lot to unpack here. A tragic event, a judge grappling with his legacy and the legitimacy of his successor, and a public struggling to make sense of it all.
And perhaps through this exploration, we can find some glimmers of understanding, some lessons learned, and some hope for a future where such tragedies become less frequent.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into the psychological pressures faced by those in positions like judges, which you touched on earlier,
Yeah, okay.
let's back up for a moment and really examine this whole voter turnout issue. You mentioned it speaks to a broader concern about the health of our democracy. What do you mean by that?
Well, the foundation of any successful democracy rests on the active participation of its citizens. Voting is the most fundamental way we express our voice, our preferences, our vision for the society we want to live in.
But what happens when a significant portion of the population chooses not to participate? What does that say about their faith in the system, their sense of agency, their belief that their vote actually matters?
That's where things get complicated. Voter apathy can stem from a multitude of factors. Distrust in the system, feeling like one's vote doesn't make a difference, lack of information about the candidates or issues,
Right.
or even just plain indifference. But regardless of the cause, the consequences can be far-reaching.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about what those numbers represent.
Exactly. Low voter turnout can erode the legitimacy of elected officials, create a sense of disconnect between the government and the governed, and ultimately weaken the very fabric of our democracy. It creates a breeding ground for cynicism, for the feeling that the system is rigged, that those in power don't really represent the will of the people.
And that cynicism can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people believe their vote doesn't matter, they're less likely to vote, which further reinforces the idea that this system is broken. It's a vicious cycle.
Precisely. And breaking that cycle requires a multifaceted approach, one that addresses the underlying causes of voter apathy and re-engages citizens in the democratic process. We'll delve deeper into potential solutions later, but it's important to acknowledge the gravity of the issue and understand why Judge Yekel felt compelled to raise it even in his final days.
It's almost like he was trying to leave us with a warning, a reminder that our democracy is fragile and requires constant vigilance and participation to thrive.
And perhaps his story, as tragic as it is, can serve as a wake-up call, prompting us to reflect on our own civic engagement and consider how we can contribute to a more vibrant and participatory democracy, because ultimately the health of our nation depends on it.
Powerful words. And a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the psychological pressures faced by those in positions of authority like judges.
Okay.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue unraveling this complex and thought-provoking story. Welcome back. We just finished talking about voter apathy, but before we dive into possible solutions, I want to circle back to that Reddit comment about making your job your identity, because it really stuck with me. What are your thoughts on the psychological pressures faced by those in positions like Judge Yekel's?
It's a crucial aspect of the story that we can't overlook. Imagine the weight of every decision, knowing it can profoundly impact people's lives. Add to that the constant scrutiny, the expectation of impartiality, and the potential for criticism from all sides. It's a lot to bear.
It's like walking a tightrope every day, never quite knowing when you might lose your balance. And as you mentioned earlier, the loss of that role, especially in a way that feels out of your control, can be devastating.
Absolutely. Judges, despite their authority, are human beings with emotions, vulnerabilities, and the need for connection, just like everyone else. And the very nature of their job can sometimes make it difficult to foster those connections.
Because they have to maintain a certain distance, a sense of objectivity.
Precisely. They can't be seen as favoring one side or the other, even in their personal lives. This can lead to a sense of isolation, a feeling that they can't truly confide in others for fear of judgment or jeopardizing their impartiality.
So they end up building walls around themselves, even though human connection is so vital for well-being. It's almost like a paradox.
It is a paradox, and one that can take a toll, especially over time. We often talk about burnout in high-stress professions, but there's also a risk of what I call moral injury.
Moral injury, that's a term I haven't heard before.
It's a concept that originated in the military, but it applies to anyone whose job requires them to make difficult decisions that may conflict with their personal values. It's the feeling of having violated one's own moral code, even if it was done in the line of duty.
So for a judge, that could mean having to hand down a sentence they feel is unjust, or dismissing a case they believe has merit, all because they're bound by the law.
Exactly. And over time, those moral compromises, even if necessary, can erode one's sense of integrity, leading to feelings of guilt, shame, and disillusionment.
Which brings us back to Judge Yekel and his attempt to resign. Could that have been a manifestation of moral injury? Was he struggling with the weight of his decisions, the feeling that the system he dedicated his life to was somehow failing?
It's impossible to know for certain, of course, but his concern about low voter turnout could be seen as a symptom of that disillusionment if he felt the system was no longer truly representative of the people. Perhaps he felt morally compelled to step aside.
And yet, Governor Kemp rejected his resignation. What are the implications of that decision from a legal and procedural standpoint?
Well, it's a reminder that our system is built on a foundation of laws and procedures. There's a process for everything, including resignation. And while there's certainly room for discretion, it's not something that can be done on a whim or based solely on personal feelings.
So in a way, Kemp was upholding the integrity of the system, even if it meant potentially overlooking Yekel's personal struggles.
Yes, you could interpret it that way, and it highlights the tension that often exists between individual needs and the demands of institutions.
It's a delicate balance for sure,
Yeah.
but it makes you wonder if there's a way to build more flexibility into the system, to recognize that sometimes compassion and understanding need to trump rigid adherence to rules.
That's a valid point, and it speaks to the need for greater awareness of mental health issues, not just in the legal profession, but in all sectors of society. We need to create cultures where people feel comfortable seeking help without fear of stigma or professional repercussions.
So it's about creating a more humane system, one that recognizes the inherent worth and vulnerability of every individual, regardless of their position or status.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in mindset from viewing mental health as a weakness to seeing it as an integral part of overall well-being.
Okay, so we've talked about the pressures of judging, the potential for moral injury, and the need for greater mental health awareness. But what about solutions? What can be done to better support those in high-stress roles, particularly those whose identities are so closely tied to their work?
Well, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but there are several things that can be done. First, as we've discussed, destigmatizing mental health issues is crucial. This requires open conversations, education, and a willingness to see mental health as part of the human experience, not something to be ashamed of.
And that starts with leadership, right? If those at the top are willing to be vulnerable and talk about their own struggles, it creates a culture where others feel safe to do the same.
Absolutely. Leaders set the tone. They have the power to create environments where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength and self-awareness rather than weakness. And this applies not just to judges, but to leaders in all fields.
Beyond changing the culture, what are some more concrete steps that can be taken?
Well, providing access to confidential counseling services is essential. This could be through employer-sponsored programs or partnerships with mental health organizations. Peer support groups can also be incredibly valuable, providing a space for individuals to connect with others who understand the unique pressures of their profession.
It's about creating a sense of community, a feeling that they're not alone in their struggle.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just about having someone to talk to, someone who can listen without judgment and offer a different perspective.
Okay, so we've got counseling, peer support.
Yeah.
What about more systemic changes?
That's where things get a bit more complex. We need to look at the structures and expectations within these professions. Are there ways to reduce workload, promote work-life balance, or create more opportunities for professional development that focuses on well-being?
So it's about building a more sustainable system, one that supports the people within it rather than grinding them down.
Precisely. And it requires a shift in thinking from viewing productivity as the ultimate goal to recognizing that human well-being is the foundation of any successful organization, whether it's a corporation or a government agency.
And that brings us back to Judge Yekel and his tragic end. It's a reminder that we can't afford to wait until someone reaches a breaking point to offer support. We need to be proactive to build systems that prioritize well-being and to create cultures where asking for help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
Well said. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's carry that message with us. Let's explore what each of us can do, both individually and collectively, to create a more humane and supportive world where tragedies like this become less likely.
And on that note, stay tuned for part 3, where we'll delve into potential solutions for voter apathy and leave you with some thought-provoking questions to ponder. Welcome back to our final part exploring the story of Judge Yekel.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the pressures of his role to the broader implications of low voter turnout.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears and focus on solutions.
Okay.
We've hinted at some already, but I'm eager to hear your thoughts on what we can do to prevent similar tragedies and strengthen our democratic systems.
It's a crucial step, isn't it? Moving from understanding the problem to envisioning a better future.
Yeah.
We've talked about the need for greater mental health awareness and support,
Right.
especially in high-stress professions.
Right, and we touched on some ideas like confidential counseling, peer support groups, even leadership modeling vulnerability.
Right.
But I'm wondering, what about the systemic changes? Are there ways to build more flexibility into these roles to create safety nets before someone reaches a breaking point?
Absolutely. One idea gaining traction is mandatory mental health check-ins. Similar to how we have regular physicals, it could be a confidential, non-judgmental space for judges to discuss any pressures they're facing without fear of repercussions.
That sounds promising, but I imagine there could be resistance, and some might see it as intrusive or unnecessary.
There's always pushback when it comes to changing established systems, especially those built on tradition and hierarchy.
Right.
But the cost of inaction is far greater. We can't afford to keep losing talented individuals to burnout, disillusionment, or worse.
It's about shifting the mindset, right? From seeing mental health as a private matter to recognizing it as a collective responsibility.
Precisely, we need to foster a culture where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength and self-awareness. And that requires open communication resources and leadership that prioritizes well-being alongside performance.
So we've got some concrete steps for supporting those in demanding roles. Now, what about tackling voter apathy?
Right.
We talked about its potential impact on our democracy, that feeling of disenfranchisement. How do we re-engage people and make them feel like their vote truly counts?
It's a complex challenge.
Yeah. But I believe solutions start with addressing the reasons why people disengage in the first place.
Okay.
Some feel disillusioned with the political process, believing their vote won't make a difference. Others lack information about candidates or issues, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of it all.
And some simply don't see the relevance to their daily lives.
Right.
They feel disconnected from the issues being debated.
Exactly. So we need strategies that target each of these areas.
Okay.
For those feeling unheard, we need to make voting more accessible. Expanding early voting periods, making Election Day a national holiday, or exploring online voting options could remove barriers to participation.
Those are great ideas, but I imagine they come with logistical and security concerns, especially online voting.
Of course, any change requires careful consideration and planning.
Right.
But we can't let those challenges paralyze us. We need to innovate and adapt to meet the needs of a changing electorate.
What about those who feel uninformed or overwhelmed? How do we make civic engagement more manageable and less daunting? That's where education and technology can play a crucial role. Imagine user-friendly apps that provide unbiased information about candidates, their stances on key issues, and even local voting guides.
It's about empowering people with the knowledge they need to make informed decisions without getting bogged down in partisan rhetoric.
Exactly. We need to cultivate a culture of informed civic engagement where people feel confident and equipped to participate in the democratic process.
And for those who feel disconnected from the issues, how do we bridge that gap and show them how politics actually impacts their lives?
I think storytelling is key here. We need to move beyond abstract policy debates and connect political decisions to real-world consequences. Sharing personal stories about how policies impact individuals and communities can make politics more relatable and relevant.
So it's about humanizing the process, reminding people that behind every policy decision, there are real people whose lives are affected.
Precisely, and that's what Judge Yekel's story has done for us today, hasn't it? It's reminded us that even those in positions of authority are human beings with vulnerabilities, hopes, and struggles.
It's a powerful reminder that our systems are made up of individuals, and those individuals need support, compassion, and a voice.
And it's a call to action for each of us to examine our own roles in shaping a more just and empathetic society, whether it's advocating for mental health resources, engaging in thoughtful political discourse, or simply listening to those around us with empathy and understanding we all have a part to play.
So as we conclude this deep dive, let's carry that message with us. Let's commit to building a world where every voice is valued, every individual is supported, and our democratic systems truly reflect the will of the people.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make a difference.